It feels like the world of compact electric family cars is getting bigger by the day sometimes, and these are two of the most interesting new contenders, the smart #1 and the Jeep Avenger. Both cost from roughly £35,000 or £400 per month for a mid-range model, and both, with funky looks, loads of tech and a driving range of some 250 to 270 miles, they're very closely matched. I say interesting because both of these cars are trying to offer something new to what's becoming a really crowded class. So the Smart, now this is a brand that certainly felt like it had disappeared altogether. It never actually did. It did continue selling the 4.2 for quite a long time, but it was certainly in dormancy. And this is their first model of a very new era for them. It's based on the Volvo EX30 platform. It is called the #1. Don't call it a number one, it's hashtag for cool people who know how to use social media and that kind of thing. So it's about Volkswagen ID3 sized. It is not a terribly small car, so 4.3 metres long. And I think it has got a lot of potential. It's a really interesting thing. Brings a lot of new ideas to the class. The Jeep, on the other hand, is a slightly smaller car, despite the fact that it costs a very similar price, a little bit cheaper. But I do think the Jeep looks great. Now, this is like 4.1 metres long, so more like Volkswagen Polo sized. And it is also, I think, the better looking of these two cars. I think it looks really cool, really chunky, and I just really love the way it looks. Whereas the Smart, well, certainly modern, but it's kind of droopy, isn't it? Looks like it's kind of been left a bit close to the radiator for a bit too long. The Jeep is also a lot lighter. It comes in at 1,536 kilograms compared with 1,820 kilos for the Smart. But then that's only to be expected because the Jeep is smaller and has a dinkier 54 kilowatt hour battery, where the Smart gets a 66 kilowatt hour battery. For all that, the driving range is rather similar on both, with the Jeep managing up to 254 miles according to WLTP tests, while the Smart will push on to 273. Surely, you would therefore imagine that the Jeep is going to be a lot less practical than the Smart. But that's not really the case because actually the boot is virtually the same size. This is 355 litres, so it is a bit smaller. We'll look at the Smart in a bit more detail in a second. But you've still got plenty of space in here for, you know, a chunky single buggy or big grocery shop. You've got an underfloor storage space there for your cables. So it's really not bad at all. There's a decent amount of space in the back seats of the Jeep too. Headroom is very good, and while taller adults or teens will be a bit short of legroom, this is still a comfy space for a couple of kids. The semi-SUV ride height also makes access good for faffing about with car seats. It's pretty good up front in the Avenger too. I just think it looks really fun. They're obviously going for a youthful audience, the same as Smart. So you've got the sort of brightly coloured finish here. This is a first edition test car, so you get pretty much everything as standard. But I think if you're speccing up your Avenger, I'd go for the mid-spec car and just add the winter pack because that brings the heated seats. But other than that, you do get the, on the altitude, you get the everything else you want. Adaptive cruise, you get your keyless entry, so you don't need to add much else. And that's pretty much the sweet spot, I think, for comfort and price. But other than that, it's pretty comfy. I wish it did have lumbar adjustment. You don't get lumbar adjustment at all on the Jeep. So that is one big gripe I've got for my creaky middle-aged lady's back. And I really like it. You get quite a decent amount of storage. The door space isn't great. You can't really get any big bottles in there. But you get a really big cubby in here. And I don't even mind the sort of iPad cover sort of lid that you get. I think it's pretty cool. Every Jeep gets this infotainment system too. It's not quite up there with Kia and Hyundai for usability, but the graphics are really good. You can customise the homepage, there are physical shortcut buttons to hop between features, and it's mostly a very logical system to use. You do, of course, get nav and wireless CarPlay and Android Auto as standard, not to mention proper aircon controls. The boot in the Smart, has to be said, is one of the more disappointing areas when it comes to the practicality of this car. Because, as we know, it's a slightly bigger car, and yet, actually, I don't think the boot in here is any more practical than in the Jeep. Yes, it's got 411 litres, so officially more space than the Jeep. But that's because these rear seats actually slide fore and aft, and you only get that space when they're slid as far forward as possible. With them as far back as possible, you get 273 litres. To be honest, I think more important than that is that actually it's quite a high load lip, and a lot of that space is underneath the boot floor. You get loads of underfloor storage there. And even if you do have the seat slid forward to prioritise boot space, you end up with kind of a gully at the end there. So when you've got your groceries in there, your beans are going to roll down there and it's going to disappear and it's all going to be quite impractical. So I do like the fact that it's got the sliding seats. That's useful. But in truth, I don't think for luggage space this is any more practical than the Jeep. Although I will give it credit because it has got a bit of front storage in the nose of the car, which is good for keeping your cables out of the way. With the seats slid back, you get masses of legroom in the Smart, but given how tiny the boot is with them in that position, you're probably going to want to keep them a bit more forward, which means that you do eat into that legroom quite a lot. You do at least get a centre armrest and a through loading hatch, which is something I think Jeep should really have included on the Avenger. You can tell as soon as you get into the Smart that this is a bit more of a premium prospect than the Jeep, just in the sort of damping of things. This really nice sliding cover here, it's got a really nice clicky feel to it. The way the vents move, it just feels just so. So it's really, I have to say, definitely feels a bit classier than the Jeep, so I like that about it. You sit very high, it's quite a peculiar driving position because the bonnet feels very low, the seat feels quite high, this is as low as it goes. So you do feel a bit like you're perched on the car rather than sitting in it. I like to sit a bit lower. But visibility is pretty good, and you know, it genuinely is quite a nice interior. I do like it. You also get good equipment. You're probably going to want to go for the higher spec premium version because that gets a heat pump as standard. By the way, you get heat pump as standard on every Avenger, but the Smart does better the Jeep in that it gets a sunroof and heated seats as standard across the range, which cost extra on most of the Jeep models. So it's a bit 6 of one, half a dozen of the other on that front. Nonetheless, really nice, and also the infotainment is, well, as with the rest of the Smart, let's say interesting. The big touchscreen in the Smart is quite interesting in its own way, with some very novel graphics and that little fox avatar in the corner. However, it does also get very annoying because some of the icons are quite small, none of it is terribly intuitive, and even for simple things like finding the nav, it can be harder than you would imagine. Still, you do get wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and you do lose the fox when you use those systems too. The Smart #1 then. So we're talking about a rear-wheel drive platform, and you get 269 brake horsepower. In this one, it's normal #1. You can get a Brabus version, which gets 4-wheel drive and will do 0 to 62 in 3.9 seconds. Personally, I think this one is more than fast enough, and this does 0 to 62 in 6.9 seconds. So I can't really argue with that, especially because it handles really nicely too. So you can really sort of fling this car into corners. It's got a pretty decent turning circle too, and then it really sort of shoves itself out of corners. You can kind of feel it pushing itself in a way that front wheel drive cars don't. So there is actually, it's quite fun to drive this. I like it. It's got quite quick sort of response to the steering when you turn into a corner as well. It all feels quite nippy and wieldy and chuckable. I like that. So I think Smart have done a really good job of that, and the ride, it's pretty well composed as well. We're on 19-inch wheels here, and yet it's a little bit lumpy and fidgety at lower speeds, but really not bad. It's quite sort of well damped and just easy to forget about, and you just make decent progress. So I do think that Smart have done a really good job of the way that this car drives. I still just find that particularly when you're driving, this screen is really annoying because you've got the funky world with all the graphics and the fox and stuff, and none of it makes any logical sense. I just want a button for the nav, a button for the media, a button for CarPlay, and I want some easy climate controls, and that's it. And I just find almost everything in that screen quite hard to find. So that is a kind of a constant irritation for me. But I am probably quite a bit older than the sort of average demographic Smart is expecting to buy this car. So maybe I'm just a bit out of date, and the people who are going to buy this car, who are all very, you know, on point with TikTok and all of that, well, they might absolutely love this. I don't, but I do like the rest of the car. Charging in the Smart is up to 150 kilowatts, which is good for an 80% top-up in 30 minutes, provided you plug into a powerful enough rapid charger. As for real-world range, we saw around 220 miles in the near-freezing conditions that we tested the Smart in, while we would expect that to creep up to around 240 to 250 miles in summer conditions. So, the Jeep Avenger, we know it's a bit slower than the Smart, quite a lot slower, 9 seconds to 62, it's got 154 brake, and you know what, I really don't care because I really like the way this car drives, and I actually think it's got more than enough performance for what you want, as long as you don't put it in Eco, because it does feel pretty slow in Eco, because it really neuters the throttle response to try and sort of encourage you not to drive too quickly. And it also kills the climate control in Eco mode to try and save as much energy as possible, which really annoys me, because I would quite like to have the Eco powertrain but keep the climate on, because I don't want to be cold. Anyway, that's a different matter. The way it drives, really nice. Rides nicely, it's fast enough, it's actually got a really nice sort of 30 to 60 or 70 sprint time in normal or sport modes. The steering's really predictable, it's got quite a nice feel to it actually. It's not as fast and encouraging as the Smart. The Smart feels really darty and kind of you know, verging on sort of almost a sort of hot hatch like. But the Jeep is definitely very confident, really pleasant, and I just think it's exactly what most people are going to want from a little car like this. And you can feel how small it is. It does feel lighter and more compact and just more city appropriate than the Smart, to be honest, in many ways. And that's what I love about this car, is that we need small EVs that aren't too heavy, and this is a really good example of that. I do wish that they'd make the brake regen easier to adjust both in the Jeep and the Smart. Both of these cars have 2 levels of brake regen, which is where the car brakes when you lift off the throttle to harvest energy. I like the system in Hyundais and Kias where you can toggle through those on the pedals on the wheel, because then you've got easy access to it. Both of these cars, you either have to use the gear selector down here or the screen. Anyway, they're fine, they bleed in smoothly, easy to get used to. Both of these cars are really nice to drive. The Smart is the one to go for if you want something a bit hot hatchy. The Jeep is just lovely and neutral and comfy and a really nice, smooth thing to spend time in. One of the good things about the Jeep is that it is really efficient. You might see the range drop to around 180 miles on a very cold motorway run, but most of the time we saw about 200 to 220 miles, even in very cold winter conditions, so not far off what you get in the Smart despite its bigger battery. The Jeep charges at 100 kilowatts, so not quite as fast as the Smart, but because it's a smaller battery, you're still going to get an 80% charge in around half an hour. Interestingly, both of these cars are rated for towing, with the Avenger pipped at 1,200 kilograms maximum for a braked trailer, while the Smart manages an impressive 1,600 kilos. It's a tricky one, this, because I really rather like both of these cars. There's sort of a bit of intrigue to them both. I think they're sort of making an effort to be a bit different to the rest of the cars in this class, and I like that about them. But they're also quite disparate characters between these two. So the Smart is definitely the more premium. It's very overtly youthful and funky. It's really trying to be cool. Whereas the Jeep is a little bit more no-nonsense, a bit more fuss-free. And I quite like that about it. So it's kind of take your pick as to which of those attitudes you prefer. But for me, I'm going to give this one to the Jeep. Largely because although I think both of these cars drive really nicely, and I know the Smart's a lot faster, I really like the fact that the Jeep is a compact car. We need more lightweight, small EVs, and the Jeep is a really good example of that, given that it has such a good real-world range as well. So that really is what sways it for me, and sort of slightly usefully cheaper finance as well. You can expect to save about 30 or 40 quid a month on the Jeep over the equivalent Smart. So, Smart, I like it, good effort, but the win here goes to the Jeep. Don't forget to head to cargurus.co.uk for a whole host of fantastic used cars, including loads of electric cars. And while we've got you, please do like the video, subscribe to the CarGurus UK YouTube channel and turn your notifications on. Ring that little bell so that you don't miss any of our videos.